We're going to talk about pavement markings now. And with this module, we're going to focus on the PM, the pavement markings, in section 1300. And we're going to talk about three main items. We're going to talk about a general overview of high-level items related to the standards, how to use them. We're also going to talk about some of the significant changes that have occurred with the recent updates since 2016. And we're also going to overview some of the basics of the materials themselves, the different types of markings and retroreflectivity. So with this first section, we're going to cover some of the general aspects of pavement markings. So some specific topics will include contrast markings. We'll also talk about the appropriate way to do our quantities estimations, and also what is the designer's responsibilities and what is the pavement marking manager's responsibilities. So in 2016, updates were made to Section 1300 of the PMs, with some subsequent changes made in 2018. And the reason why we did those was based largely in part feedback from you folks, the actual practitioners, boots on the ground, so to speak. A lot of the changes came straight from you folks, and we appreciate that, and we continue to solicit that feedback over time so that we can continue. This is a living document so that we can continue to update it and make it usable for all of us. So Harry alluded earlier in his introduction to some of the reasons why the PM marking standards were changed, one of which is the oncoming autonomous vehicles that we keep hearing about, right? And certain marking widths and spacing patterns that we want to standardize so that as these vehicles come online, they understand the roadway and they function properly. Some of the other changes have to do with cost. You can imagine that with the thousands and thousands of miles of pavement markings we have on our system, that what may seem like an insignificant change, like a spacing of our mini skips, when you add that up across the system, it can result in significant changes to cost, significant cost savings. And then finally, the last reason is safety. And I shouldn't say last because it is the most critical in everything that we do is safety. But some recent findings as far as the crash modification factors associated with changing widths and ensuring that retroreflectivity is in place. All right, so let's start off with cost estimating. Okay, it's very important that we do this correctly, right? We don't want to underestimate a project, underbid a project. So for example, when we talk about our standard skip marks, our 10 by 30s, that's 10 feet of marking, a 30-foot gap. So when we measure that, if we have 800 linear feet, for example, of a project of 10 by 30s, our quantity would not be 800 feet, right? What would it be? Anybody want to? 25% of that, right? 10 is 25% of that 40 foot as you go along. So we want to make sure that we are accounting for that accurately. Same with our mini skips, for example. Same with our double yellow lines. If you have a 800-foot section of double yellow lines, it's not 800 in your quantities, it's 1,600. Excellent, thank you. All right, something else to keep in mind is how do we track and account for our temporary markings, because we do have to account for those as well. Section 512 has information on the appropriate way of doing that. One thing to keep in mind, though, is that there is no eradication item for temporary markings. That's built into the temporary marking bid item quantity itself. Okay. Also, one other thing to keep in mind when we're talking about tracking our temporary markings is that we want to, if your project has multiple phases, your MOT has multiple phases, we'd like to quantify those separately for each phase of a project. Okay. Continuing along on this theme of quantification estimation, for mill and overlay projects, temporary markings may be required not only on the milled surface, but sometimes on the final surface as well. So for example, if it's not inlaid, right, which is obvious, you would see that, there will be a period of time perhaps when the pavement is drying that we will need temporary markings on that final surface as well. So there's a certain amount of time that's specified for how long the road can remain unmarked. It's up to 96 hours. It can be 0 hours to 96 hours. So we want to make sure that we are adhering to those requirements. Also note that there are different time limits for construction projects than there are for the repaving. Okay, so distinguish between the two types of projects. All right, for paving schedule, the contract, as it says down at the bottom, must specify in the schedule of routes the locations where the following are required. Your temporary stop bars, your temporary crosswalks, we can't forget about these, your temporary pavement message markings, and sometimes symbols. So I won't pick on VDOT here, but I've been in localities, locally maintained roads, where an MOT was in place and they did not put the temporary arrows. And this was a system where we were converting through lanes to turn lanes, and you can imagine that if you didn't have your arrows, chaos, right? So we have to remember to include those other items and not just our linear longitudinal items. Okay, contrast markings. All right, there's two types, and you can see the two types demonstrated in these pictures. Okay, there is the outlined type, which you can see on the bottom picture there with the double yellows, and also on the right. Okay, and then there is also the alternating pattern, which you can see where you have your marking and then the black, right? It's important to note, though, that these contrast markings have no legal meaning. So they are there just for enhancing the visibility of the markings. So there's nothing in the MGCD, nothing in the Uniform Code as to their meaning. They are just embellishments. Either of these alternating patterns can be chosen. It's up to the designer. Although I will say that the blocks there, you'll see, those aren't used that often in Virginia. We more traditionally see and use the outlining method. But either one is available for design. It should be noted that the bordered version does require type B6, which can be expensive. So take that into account as to the appropriate locations, because that cost can add up if we are using that B6 everywhere for contrast. We do measure these in linear feet. So unlike what I was saying before about doubling up, this is measured in linear feet. But there are certain places where we do really like to see these contrast markings. We know where those are, right? Concrete, right? Especially our bridges of certain length require them over 300 feet long. I'm sorry, not require, should be careful with my language. It's highly recommended on bridges greater than 300 feet long. Other curved roadways and bridges, and as I mentioned, any concrete surface, it helps to bring out the visibility of those markings. All right, retroreflectivity, which is different from reflectivity. Reflectivity is when the light hits an object and it's reflected in all directions, right? Retroreflectivity is a special type of reflectivity. And that's when the light from your headlamp or your headlights is reflected directly back at the source of the light, right? We get the retroreflectivity. I think Mark mentioned it in his session on signs. For pavement markings, we get the oh man, that's a hard one, isn't it? Just me? Or maybe it's because I'm on camera. Retroreflectivity. It is a mouthful, but it is different from reflectivity. That's why I have to keep saying it over and over again. With the glass beads that are included in our markings. Whether they're included before the material comes to us or they're mixed in the field, it's the glass beads that provides that retroreflectivity. So you can see that the diagrams here is just simple to demonstrate the difference between reflectivity and retroreflectivity and the importance of the positioning of the headlamps and how it gets back to you. Federal Highway has a lot of information on this subject. There are different methods of testing for retroreflectivity that the federal highway allow. Also, something to note is that the MUTCD, the 2009 version, you may recall, had retroreflective criteria for bringing all signs up to standard, right? It wasn't in the MUTCD there wasn't an analogous or similar requirement for pavement markings, because at the time, measuring retroreflectivity in pavement markings was not really as far ahead as it is on the signs. There was disagreement on how to do it and what the threshold should be. So that, we understand, is changing with the next version of the MUTCD, which is anticipated in the next year or two. So there will be standards and thresholds for our pavement markings as well. But it is anticipated, like the sign retroreflectivity criteria, it's not that every marking will have to meet those standards by a certain date, but more so that the DOT, VDOT has a program in place so that the retroreflectivity is tested over time, or that the retroreflectivity is in place with the next paving schedule. So it's not making sure that everything's replaced by a certain time. So not to worry, okay? So it's just making sure that there is that schedule so that the next time it is touched, it's going in properly with the appropriate retroreflectivity. Okay, so we're going to move on. We're going to talk about those materials. Okay, so you'll see A through E. Does anybody remember that there used to be an F? Yep, F you don't see on our list anymore. F was removed. It was pretty redundant, so we just moved it out. You also see another gap, right? There's no 5. There's no B5 anymore, right? So we skipped from 4 to 6. We got rid of B5 as well. We'll talk a little bit more about that. But Section 704 describes all of these and discusses all of the criteria involved. 704, the specifications. So type A is our most basic, our oldest form of marking. That's paint, liquid paint, right? And that can be used for permanent or temporary markings. Then we have our more durable markings. Those are your types B. That's whether it be epoxy or a thermoplastic and the different types of thermoplastic, and then your tapes, right? And as you go along, you get more expensive, with our B6 tape being the most expensive. But there's a reason why it's expensive, right? In the 2007 spec book, type A and type F material were virtually identical. That's why we got rid of F. We also got rid of type 5 in 2002. So some of us remember those. They're no longer there. So we're not going to talk about every single type of pavement marking. We're just going to kind of cover the basic types here. All right, starting with paint. Waterborne paint, it's like I said, it's our oldest type of marking material. You can add retroreflectivity to paint with glass beads, so it covers that safety criteria. And the reason why we have those glass beads, as we mentioned, visibility at night, but also visibility during wet conditions. Mark, I think, mentioned the Afton Mountain crash. Retroreflectivity, it's very important that we have that in there, regardless of the type of marking. So paint, simple, straightforward application. You can, multiple ways of applying it, whether it be with trucks or self-propelled machines. As I mentioned, it's used permanent and temporary. It's easy to install, right? It's a lot easier to install than any type of like epoxy where you're mixing in the field, anything like that. Put in the equipment, shoot it out, we're good to go. It's the least expensive for that reason, obviously, because of the materials that go into it. It's waterborne and it's easy to apply, so it's cheap. But it's not as durable as some of those other materials that we mentioned. So 1 year typical is about how long our paint lasts. Heavier volumes, like our freeways, limited access roads, it's even less than that, right? 6 months maybe. So the reason for that low durability, heavy traffic, right? It's degrading the paint over time, so the more wheels over it, the less visible it becomes, especially at night or under those wet conditions. Eventually it wears entirely off the roadway if we don't continue to maintain it properly. So multiple applications, though, could result in a higher life cycle cost, right? Because we're applying it more frequently, especially those high volume roads. If it's every 6 months, we're adding to that life cycle cost that we're trying to keep down. Right now, VDOT is piloting. I don't know, Mark, that's not raising it. Okay.
No, that's raising my hand.
Okay. VDOT is
Raising my hand.
got it. VDOT is piloting right now a high build paint with type 3 beads. I don't know, has anybody experienced that, taking part in the pilot? Okay, any comments?
Actually, last week we had a VDOT come out and done a retro on it. After 6 months, it's still getting anywhere in the high 200s, low 300s, versus the standard type A. We're getting around 90 to 100. So within the first 6 months, it's standing out pretty well. The real test to come here once we put snowplows on it. So we should know more as we go along. But as of right now, it's doing good. Still has a wet reflective. It's not where we want it, but it's holding up well.
And cost-wise compared to standard paint?
I don't have numbers in front of me. I would say somewhere probably not double, but
Okay. So paint is typically like 10 to 25 cents per linear foot, so we're talking about,
paints usually run around 5 to 6 cents per foot, so we're probably talking about 10 cents a foot, maybe.
oh, okay.
The beads, what makes it cost a little bit more, because the beads are a little bit more expensive.
Mm-hmm. Great. All right, thank you.
Do you want me to comment on that?
Sure.
So again, this was the first time that VDOT had actually done this that I'm aware of. And so the readings are good for traffic paint. And we're only using one type of bead, what's called a large bead, a type 3 bead. We are looking at other options, and stay tuned. I mean, this is just a pilot. There may be some pilots on this coming paving schedule. But you know, we've learned a lot by trying it. You know, if it fails, we tried. We learned something from it. So let me repeat again the retro readings for the audience. Did we get a wet retro reading?
Yes, and unfortunately I wasn't there. My field guys were telling me just by conversation. I do not know what their wet was. They did do a wet reflection test, but they told me numbers in the high 200s, 300s still after 6 months. But that is not a wet reflective. I think their wet reflective values were a little low.
So the white was getting you 200 to 300, and what was the yellow getting you?
It's around the same.
Around 200 to 300, which is relatively good for traffic paint. And again, that's because it's thicker and it's a type 3 bead.
What road?
234 in Prince William County.
Okay. Well, thing to take away, paint, it's cheap, it can be applied on any surface, and as a result, it can pretty much be applied pretty short notice, so.
And with these pilots, I would say, for you designers, right now it's just type A. There is only one type of paint. But in the future, if these pilots are successful and we start to use them on a monitoring basis, we might be going to a type A class 1 and a type A class 2 or something like that. So just stay tuned.
Great. So moving on, thermo, the start of our more durable markings. There's two types. There's type 1, type 2. Type 1 is only used on longitudinal lines. Type 2 we use on our arrows and our messages, and our transverse lines, so our crosswalks and our stop bars, right? Type B1 markings have much longer durability, as I mentioned, whereas paint is 1 to 2 years or maybe as short as 6 months on high volume roads. Our thermos are lasting upwards of 3 years. Maybe some of you have varying lifespans that you've become accustomed to using thermo. The retroreflectivity is at least twice, if not 3 times, better than what you would have in paint, but that comes with the cost. Like I said, it's $1.20 to $3 per linear foot. At least that's what you got a different number out there maybe?
Long line applications of
Thermo type 1?
contractor, for the liquid, 4-inch, 48 cents, up to about 88 cents for around 8-inch.
Okay. So your numbers are coming in a lot lower. So,
That's your contract value of the current contract we have.
yeah, okay. Yeah, it's very good. So as I mentioned, the takeaways of thermo, right? It's more costly, but it does provide much better thermo or retroreflectivity. Class 1 is applied as the molten liquid, right, in the field. It's melted and then applied by the machine, and then of course it has to dry. So it goes on as that gooey consistency. All right. Whereas type 2 is preformed, right? That's where, oh, missed that one. Yep, thank you. Type 2 is the preformed application. So, for example, shark's teeth of a yield marking, right? You'll see it comes in those triangles. And that's why sometimes these precast are better, because they come formed. There's not really too much room for error in applying the marking in the field, because it is coming in with the right dimensions. Class 2 marking should be specified for all transverse lines, as I mentioned, so your stop bars and your crosswalks, and all symbols and message markings. So they are applied with the adhesive. So again, adding to that cost, but retroreflectivity much better. Okay, so preformed thermo, it's ready for immediate use. There's no need for long lane closures when we're applying the thermo. Durability makes it especially suitable for the transverse lines. It's suitable for word message, symbol markings. We talked about the cost being more than paint, but still relatively low compared to some of our more durable tapes and such. Some of the disadvantages, though, is that somebody mentioned it before. What's our number one enemy for pavement markings? Snowplows, right? So because of that thickness, it's easier for the snowplows to catch. So especially in the cooler climates up in Nova, for example, we got to be aware of that. If that happens, we have to reapply the thermo. There's really no other choice other than to reapply that thermoplastic. One of the other disadvantages is that it does require a primer, so it's not a simple one-step process. Roadways cannot be resurfaced without scraping away all of that material. So, like I said, you have to completely eradicate it in order to reapply it. So when your snowplow does come through and mess it up, eradicate it all before we can reapply it. There's no patching it. When eradication occurs before the milling and paving, temporary paint markings may be necessary. So again, you're going to have to account for those costs for your full life cycle costs, something that we again need to be aware of. It's not just the initial application. All right. Moving on, epoxy, or type B class 3, type B3, another high durability. This is also a 2-part mixture, right, that occurs in the field. Special equipment that we need to allow for that mixing on the site. Currently, as far as I know, and maybe again you have better information, just one contractor that can do that? Any others?
I don't know, no, we don't deal with
Yeah.
too much. I know, I want to say you probably have 2 to 3 in the state probably.
Okay.
have that capability.
Okay. And I don't know, Mark, if you have heard of any others, but when we were pulling together the materials, at the time there was only one contractor that was doing, which would make sense why Nova doesn't have any experience with it. Might be one reason why Nova doesn't have any experience. The good news, though, epoxy can be used on both concrete and asphalt. So there are no limits to where it can be applied as far as the surface type. However, it can't be applied immediately after surfacing. Okay, there is a period of time before you can apply that epoxy. It can't go right on. So there, you have to, again, add that into the life cycle cost as far as your MOT that would be in place, or your temporary markings that would have to go down because of that interim period. And remember back how long we can have, 0 to 96 hours. So it all adds into that life cycle cost. Doesn't require a primer though. But a disadvantage is that if it's installed incorrectly, and there are a lot of factors that go into installation of all of our pavement markings, but epoxy especially, that you can have some problems, right? And you're gonna have to reapply. Like I said, whether the temperature's off, the moisture content is off, a lot of things go into, a lot of criteria go into how to apply the epoxy. It can take up to 45 minutes to dry. So again, keeping in mind what that would mean in terms of MOT. So this image here, that's the dried epoxy. Okay. So after it's already cooled for at least 45 minutes. All right. All right, moving on to our preformed tapes. Class 6 is the most durable and retroreflective marking material on the market, but as a result, it's also pretty expensive. So again, we'll compare numbers. I've got $4 to $6 per linear feet. Am I hearing lower?
In production, in high production, it's 350, 375. A pavement marking cost is very deceiving. If you have miles and miles of it to do at a time, so that when you mobilize as a contractor, you can do, several days, say, of markings and stay in one area, the price per foot comes down because the truck's set up, everything's ready to go. If you give a contractor 1 mile of road to stripe and that's it, his price per foot has got to cover his mobilization and his remobilization somewhere else. So that's why you see prices all over the place, is that it's really all about quantity. The more work you could lump together, the better the price.
Great. So there's a reason for that price, or there's a reason why we still apply the B6 despite the price, and that is because of its high retroreflectivity, both dry and wet. So we were talking earlier about even the pilot of the new paint is still not getting the right type of wet retroreflectivity readings that we would like, whereas the waffle pattern tape is providing that wet retroreflectivity that we desire for the appropriate safety on our roadways. And that's why we do recommend it for our most vital roadways, our interstates, and even our primaries, our limited access roadways, because of the high volume and high speeds. So good news is that the tape, it can be pressed immediately upon resurfacing, so there's no delay, there's no wait time like with the thermo or with the epoxy. It goes right down. But it is more difficult to apply to concrete. So if you are on a bridge or on a concrete roadway, it doesn't adhere as well. It can also be damaged during installation, so there's a lot of care that goes into the application of the tape, and just like any of our more durable, thicker markings, especially with the tape, the snowplow is enemy number one. And I'm sure we have all driven along roadways, we won't say VDOT roadways, but maybe in a locality, where we see a big ball of the tape on the side of the road. And that's because when a snowplow hits it, that thing's just gonna keep pulling up its tape. It's just gonna keep pulling up until at some point it'll eventually break off. And that's why we see those big balls. And when that happens, the only thing to do is to come back and reapply the tape. Right? There's no patching that one either. All right. So as you can see, again, just to cover the highlights, high durability. So we were talking about a year for the paints. We were talking about maybe 3 years for our thermos and epoxies. With our tapes, assuming that our snowplows don't get them, we have lifespans of up to 6 years. It's the highest quality marking used, and that's why we use it on our most important roadways. It provides excellent delineation on high-speed roadways and in a variety of environmental conditions. So again, the wet weather, the fogs, this is our best material at visibility. Main disadvantage, though, we talked about those. It's quite costly, 10 times more than paint, maybe 20 times more than paint, based on the numbers we were hearing today. Materials cannot be refreshed. As I mentioned, you can't just come back and paint over them. If it has to be reapplied, it has to be reapplied in whole. Eradication of it is also fairly expensive because you do have to come through and you have to scrape every little bit of that off before you throw down the new thermo. Sometimes after winter weather event, the tape is found on the ball side of the road, so that's a chore in itself, coming through and cleaning up all that crap that's been balled up on the side of the road. In general, the long life cycle means the marking will not need to be refreshed more than half the lifespan of the pavement. So think about that. So the restriping with paint will have to occur frequently, as often as every 6 months on the high volume freeways. So that's if paint, are you guys using paint sometimes come back over the thermo or over the tape?
V6?
Yeah, over the tape.
That's the
Yep.
only choice we have.
Yeah. So I think I misstated that when I said you can use paint to come back over the thermo to increase that longevity of the marking.
Yeah, but only for like 6 months.
Right.
I mean, if, like say on V6 tape, the only option you have is thermo, the only option you have is come back with latex.
Right.
Pretty much any other marking can be put on top itself, except for V6.
Mm-hmm.
That looks so bad though, that refresher paint.
Yeah.
Never the same width, it's always not the same shape even.
Mm-hmm.
Solid.
So this gets into the maintenance of the markings issue more so than the standards, but from a policy standpoint, we've gone back and put paint over B6 tape and we put paint over thermo, but that's why we're looking at the high build as a potential option for refreshing the B6 tape and putting a more durable thermoplastic that in theory could be resurfaced with a more durable thermoplastic for a second pass. So that's what we're looking at for the future, but we're not there yet. Here's what's coming in the future.
Difficult to eradicate, but it's not difficult for milling operation, right? When milling machine goes through, it's removed easily with asphalt. How deep is eradication? What's the difference between milling? Of course, milling it's all surface mix, okay? Depths less. Why it's so difficult to eradicate? Is it no?
Well, it's difficult to eradicate without damaging the surface.
I see.
Yeah, there is a type of head that basically shaves the tape, but you have to constantly stop and clean out the head because all that gluey stuff gets stuck in the head. Whereas if you try to grind it, you're going to start grinding the asphalt. So that's the challenge.
To my limited knowledge, all eradications grind asphalt.
Yeah.
That opens up another problem of leaving eradication marks, especially visible at night time, and how to treat eradications. It depends who we're talking. Material people said liquid asphalt fine. Yes, it's correct to cover exposed pieces of aggregate, but from our operational point of view, it needs to be overlaid because we need to remove this nighttime visibility from eradication marks. So ideally, if it's eradication on the tape without touching surface, it's great. But practically, again, to my knowledge, all of those eradications remove some surface.
And that's correct. Other than My understanding from the shaving head, that you can shave it enough that it damages less than the grinding methods that are out there. But you'd want to put the marking back where you originally had shaved it up, and that because you'd still have some ghost marking from that shaving exercise. And the ghost marking problem that you're mentioning is real, and in a lot of cases, it warrants just resurfacing the roadway or putting a modified latex emulsion over the surface. So one of the practices you have now is if you're going to do asphalt resurfacing, and you're not doing any milling, and if you're doing a modified latex emulsion or a slurry seal, you really want to go in and scuff up thermoplastic markings before you do that paving operation, because you don't get a good adhesion to those markings if you don't scuff them up. So there's a certain level of eradication. In some cases, all it takes is just creating a rough surface, just scuffing it up enough. But that's a paving practice if you're putting together the paving schedule.
Another problem with the tape though is you don't want to mill that up though, because it gunks up the milling machine. The teeth will catch it and pull it. And also too, then the wrap that you get from that can't be recycled as well either, because you can't have all these bits of tape in the recycled asphalt, because then it just doesn't work when you're trying to reuse that asphalt again.
Good point.
So from the point of view of designers, or I think this, the most is, if the road is it's a plant mix operation and the road is being fully reconstructed, they have ways, like you said, you can't just necessarily mill the B6 tape, it complicates it, but you can get it up. I think it's where the biggest issue is something being done outside of that. So if it's existing B6 tape and the lanes are being shifted because of either a permanent or a temporary long-term lane shift, that's where you might see the biggest issue. So knowing how to even recognize B6 tape out in the field would help, so you know that you have that issue, because it's got that very distinctive waffle pattern on the top. It's either a diamond shaped pattern or a kind of a basket weave type pattern, depending on what manufacturer it is, and there's only 2 manufacturers of the tape.
So moving on, the last one that we were going to cover is the Type D Class 3, which is a lot like the B6, except this one is primarily used in work zones, and in fact it is required by VDOT in work zones, but it can be just pulled right back up when you're done with it. But the reason why the D3 is because it does have those wet retroreflectivity qualities, just like the B6. And you can imagine in work zones where we have some of the most vulnerable conditions, we have workers, we have hazards near the travelway, why it's so important to have that highly retroreflective pavement markings through those areas. So as I mentioned, because of that, the D3 is required in work zone projects when we are using temporary tape markings. And the Type 2 is no longer allowed. The Type 2 was not producing the wet retroreflectivity that is desired, so no longer allowed. But paint is still also allowed as an alternative to the D3 tape. So you can use tape or paint. One thing to be aware of is that VDOT is working on very specific guidance on when to use the different materials in work zones, so paint or the D3. And so that's coming, so stay tuned for that. Okay, TE Memo 261.1 has a lot of information on how to apply or where to apply the Type B6 or limited access highways. As I mentioned before, that's where we want to use our B6, but not if the road will be resurfaced soon. Obviously, we want to get a long life out of that B6. So it doesn't make sense if your road's scheduled to be repaved in a year to throw down B6, and you're going to have to apply new marking. So should usually be used when you have about 5 years or so left on the life of your pavement. All right. So some other things to consider when selecting pavement marking material. Ultimate decision will vary from project to project, district to district. And we talked, I think it was Harry's joke, if you have 2 engineers, you get 4 ideas. So there is no right way. There is room for flexibility. Type B Class 1 markings shall never be used for symbols and messages. We talked about that before. They should be either Type A or the Type B2 markings. Thermo epoxy and the preformed tape are our most durable. They are more expensive though as a result. So we have to play the balancing game of safety and cost and life cycle costs and determine what is the most appropriate use of the material project to project. In order to realize the full potential of markings, the material must be applied properly. We talked about all those conditions that go into, especially those where you're mixing materials in the field. Ambient temperature, moisture, the amount of time that our lanes might be closed as a result of the drying or adhering. And proper installation, these are all factors in the optimal marking material performance. All right, moving on, updates to the PM standards, all right? So several things have changed throughout all of the PM standards, starting with our gore markings at interchanges, PM1 and PM2. Some of the things that have changed is now that you can have 30-foot spacing between those hatch marks, still at 45 degrees, but now we can go up to 30 feet, whereas before it was saying 8 foot center to center. So less material on the road, saving money. It's been shown that this spacing is still providing the right guidance to users, whereas the 8 foot was it was overkill. One thing to note, you have to have at least 3 chevrons. In a gore area, we wouldn't just put a single chevron or 2 chevrons. Don't apply chevrons unless you're going to put 3 or more down in your gore area. Designers do have the flexibility, as I mentioned in the previous slides, do have the flexibility to specify closer markings or additional markings. There's a lot of flexibility that goes into this, but you do have a maximum now. Several other states use the 10-inch and 12-inch gore lines. Virginia, the width of those longitudinal lines in the gore area, we are now specifying will be 12 inches. Okay. Safety benefits, as we talked about, the wider the markings, the more visible they are to the drivers, especially older drivers. And then also for the reasons that we stated before with the autonomous vehicles and understanding what's happening at our gores. Key exception is that the gore lines, they can stay at the thinner 8 inches if you are putting in your hatch markings or your chevrons. Okay, so if you do put those in, you don't have to go to the 12 inches. But if you don't have them, 12 inches. Okay, here's a graphic, and I don't know how well that shows up on your printed, but maybe you can see it a little bit better up here at the screen. This is the application at an off-ramp. Something else that is new is the skip marks on our deceleration lanes at interchanges. We are using 8 inches now for our width of those. We're also continuing them the entire length of the deceleration, whereas before they didn't necessarily. Sometimes they went halfway. Now we are all the way through the taper, extending those lines. Right now, it's 6 inches, so now we're going up to the wider, 12 inches at the gores, as I mentioned. Applies to all freeways, not just the interstates, but non-interstate limited access highways. There's been several safety studies that have shown, demonstrated that the wider lines, like I said, improve the visibility. They have longer longevity as well as you come back and reapply. And they're more easily detected by our advanced vehicles now. This requirement applies to all the lines that you see. Also, it applies to the white edge line marking that continues on the outside. for a certain distance. That distance, how far that continues, has to be specified in the contract documents. Okay, sometimes, usually it goes to the cross street, right? But we need to specify that in the contract documents, how long that edge line shall continue at the wider width. Okay. Most of the changes at the entrance ramps are the same as those at the exit ramp that we just saw. The difference now is here, though, you see the skip lines do not continue all the way through the transition. However, they do continue the entire length of the full width, whereas the previous standard was halfway. So we do want to continue, and the reason why, not only can it be confusing to a driver entering the facility to see 24 feet of pavement and no marking, but especially for those vehicles with the advanced tracking, the autonomous vehicles, they need more delineation in that area, and that's why we're extending those skip lines farther. Moving on. So lane drops. PM2 standards show how to properly delineate a lane drop. We now use the 3 foot by 9 foot pattern. Okay, so 3 foot marking, 9 foot skip. That's new. The previous standards had the elephant tracks, if you remember those, more of a gap. They were the 3 foot by 12 foot. So we're pulling those in a little bit tighter to help delineate those movements. At intersections, PM3 covers intersections. Should be noted that there used to be a PM4, if you recall. We split out unsignalized intersections from signalized intersections. Everything is in PM3, and sheet 3 and 4 cover the intersections, and especially when and how often, how frequently do we put our arrows and our messages. So in turn lanes that are short, less than 100, and that doesn't include our taper length, 1 arrow, okay? And then it's graduated as we get longer and longer storage lengths, full lane storage lengths, again, not including our taper length. One thing to note, though, it is still the designer's flexibility not to put the arrows if it's clearly a turn lane by the geometry, right? So a turn bay, right? Is Nova still trying to avoid arrows? Is that still Jessica? So again, there are different engineering, district preferences as far as that goes. So note that the MUTCD allows the designer to omit those arrows. So, all right. At unsignalized intersections, edgeline and centerline extensions, you can see here through the intersection. Again, you can imagine why those might be advantageous in the future for our autonomous vehicles. Again, it better delineates what's happening through an intersection for autonomous vehicles, but it's also very helpful for the old-fashioned human driver as well, especially along curves. When you have an intersection along a curve, helps to keep people on the right path. Changes to the puppy tracks, right? We've gone from the 2.4 to 2.6, so still 2 foot pavement marking, but the gap has gone from 4 feet to 6 feet. And there's some logic behind that. Not only the cost savings, because we're putting less of them, but also because of maintenance. They were so close together that as you would come back and reapply the markings, because the precision is not so great. You're laughing because you've seen it before, where they just sort of blend together. Then you just have a continuous line through your intersection, and it's not distinguishable as puppy tracks anymore. So,
What's the reason of may be extended?
maybe extend through the intersections.
Yeah, what's the reason why it's allowed now?
Again, if the roadway geometry is very clear, if you're on a straight roadway, it may not be needed. It's really a designer's preference.
You want me to answer that?
Sure. Yeah, skewed intersections is another example when you would use it, not just curves, but skewed intersections.
Yes, whenever you have a skewed intersection, it shows some benefit. It also helps delineate for not only the driver on the main road, but the driver on the side street. That is that demarcation line. Don't stick your bumper out in front of the car in front of you. Same thing with the median opening. When you put the dots at the median opening, you drastically improve safety. That's been a basic safety improvement for years.
And I would agree, definitely, but age line, when it's necessary, maybe, very rare, but on a straight segment like this, why?
Yeah, not on a straight segment, you're right, but sometimes you'll have, on a
Oh,
curve
yeah.
especially, you have a big, long opening.
It's
It's not a
deficient geometry,
well-defined
I
intersection.
guess.
Yeah.
We help to fix deficiency in geometry. But
Right.
we know, we cannot fix geometry with a pavement mark.
Well, there's a saying that the best of pavement markings can't fix bad geometrics. So, but in some cases, it does help. Particularly, it's more helpful to do what you see there for the median. That is really more of a safety improvement. But where you need that additional guidance, you can carry that through, just like you could carry an edge line in front of a driveway, a local driveway.
Puppy tracks through an intersection to define our dual left turn movements, or to better delineate a left turn movement through the intersection, is that used to have 40 feet between those. That has now been relaxed, and it is dependent upon the design vehicle that we're using. So in other words, it was a little bit too strict, too stringent to mandate that 40 feet, and it's now, if you can show through using your turning software or your turning templates that it can be closer than that, it is now allowable. Traffic engineering is now also proposing to L&D to incorporate that change into the road design manual. Another key change is that the dotted line extension for dual and triple left turn lanes has been eliminated through the crosswalk. So you can see we don't need to continue those through the crosswalk. Okay. And then, as I mentioned before, we've gone from the 2.4 to the 2.6 so that we don't have a solid line over time. Okay, PM5 is for our left turns. Okay, we have some similar changes to the puppy tracks, right? The width, not the width, the spacing. We've got two types. There's the neutral area, and then there's the kind that's continuous without the neutral area, right? We typically don't do the neutral area in Virginia. We tend to use the type B instead. Some paving schedules have hundreds of left turn arrows because of two-way left turn lanes. So we've also adjusted the spacing, not only again because of the cost, but just the over communication to the driver. For example, on a 45 mile per hour road, the old 300-foot spacing, you would see that arrow every 4.5 seconds. Okay, but now with the new standard, we put an arrow every 1,000 feet. So you're only seeing that arrow every 15 seconds. So you don't have that same information overload, and you're not putting down a lot of pavement marking material that may be unnecessary, or at least the safety benefits have not been proven with those arrows as frequent as we were placing them. But again, flexibility, the designer, if there is a need determined, you can increase that spacing if you show that there is a need. Okay, as I mentioned, there's rarely ever a reason to have the neutral zone. That's why VDOT tends not to use the type A. It's costlier, you got to throw in hatch markings, use a different type of material perhaps. And also, not to mention from an operation standpoint, you now have less room for vehicles to stack. So that's why the type B tends to get used. PM6, bicycle lanes, one new thing is that the typical cross sections are now included. These are pulled from the RDM. So now these are also in the standards, and we can see, it's a lot easier to see it in that typical section, what our minimum widths for our lanes should be given the overall width of the roadway. Of course, the designer needs to determine the appropriate course of action when the existing bike lane markings are less than these standards. So we can't just go back and put in kind. If the existing is wrong, we need to correct that and apply the correct minimum widths. There's also the new Shero marking, which I don't know if I'm supposed to say this or not, but Shero marking hasn't really been shown to have much safety impact. So they're still allowable, but hopefully we're not seeing too many of those applied anymore.
Question.
Yep.
Isn't that supposed to be in the middle of the lane?
The
The Shero?
Shero, yes. Well, it actually depends. If you have a mixing zone, then sometimes they're staggered across as you bring your cyclists back from a protected bike lane over into mixed-use traffic. So
It should be placed where the bicyclist would normally be riding, so that the driver's aware that's the case. I said should is the operative word.
If I can add to that, our standards do state the placement for the Shero, and it does match, the recent guidance that's out there from bicycle planning advocates about where to laterally place it. I think your question may come from that photo right there, where visually it looks like that may be closer to the curb than what our standards would actually require. Although I can't really tell for sure.
Okay, so more on the bike lanes. How do you feel about those arrows in Nova? Keep picking on Nova.
The added arrows?
Yeah,
Well, very rarely do we use them.
yeah, that's why I asked. Yeah, Nova District pretty much doesn't use the arrows, so just bringing that up. In most circumstances, arrows are unnecessary. Really, you only use the arrows two conditions. When you have contraflow lanes, so a lane going in each direction, that's to help the cyclist know which of those two bike lanes to be in. The other time that you would use the arrows is if you have a one-way road, you only have one direction bike lane, perhaps. Like lots of times you might have a bike lane on a grade, and it's so that cyclists take a little bit, more power and longer time to get up a hill. You might have a bike lane just on one side of the roadway. So in that case, you would want those arrows so that you don't have head-on bike collisions. Most cases, the number of Shero markings can be substantially decreased. Bicyclists riding at 12 miles per hour would pass a Shero every 14 seconds under the current standards, or the old standards. Now it's one every minute. So again, it's that information overload to the cyclist and the life cycle costs to maintain all those arrows. We've limited that. Okay. And you can imagine the cost. Those can be $150 per marking. So by going to that longer spacing, we're saving a good amount of money. Or like in Nova, if you don't put them at all. Yep.
I have a quick question. I noticed throughout the standard, all the public trucks have changed to 2-foot, 6-foot pattern.
Right.
Does that apply to roundabout too?
Does that apply to roundabouts? That's a good question. Mark? Markings at roundabouts, which we don't cover in this module, are the dash lines also 2.6 there?
National Committee on Uniform Traffic Control Devices is working to standardize all the markings for roundabouts, single lane, 2-lane, 3-lane. And so I think once we get that, then we can adopt those standards so we stay on the national scale, if you will. So, but I don't think we specifically have specified a change in the skips for roundabouts in the standards.
I'd have to go back and look. There may be a specific exception, but I don't recall for sure.
Yeah, I don't,
Good
but
question.
that's a good follow-up that we'll send
Yeah.
out to
We
everybody.
can look it up over lunch. There are copies of the standards back there.
All right, so moving on, let's get through some of these a little bit more quickly. One clarification, it was a little ambiguous previously, is whether or not the 24-inch white lines are included in the pay item for the railroad crossing marking. They are not. It's been made much more clear that they are a separate pay item. Also, should be clear that the railroad crossing symbol is placed at varying distances from the railroad crossing based on the location of the W10-1 warning sign, which is why we include the W10-1 warning sign in our drawing. Okay, something else to be aware of is the extension of our longitudinal lines through the crossing. This is new as well. Of course, there are some implications with operating in the railroad right-of-way. If the railroad comes through and chews up those markings, they are not obligated to replace them, so just something to be aware of. But it's very important because in Long Island in 2017 alone, there were 21 crashes involving a vehicle that veered out of the vehicular path and into the rails. So it's been adopted in Florida, and now Virginia is following suit in recommending those longitudinal markings through. But of course, it can't be applied everywhere when you have the hump crossings. So obviously designer's preference, but there have been proven safety benefits to continuing to provide that delineation through the railroad crossing. Okay, word marking and arrow details. There is a helpful guide in there to help you with your pay item, your quantities for some of the standard messages, but not every potential message is in there, sorry, but there are a lot of them in there that should help speed up that process with the standard square footages. The handicap symbol, something to be aware of is that is not required. It's the sign that actually is, by law, denotes the handicap spacing. But there are some times when we want to apply that marking as well, and for example, rest areas. Also, when we have a handicap space on street, parallel parking, for example, then we quite often do apply the paint as well, or I'm sorry, I should say the marking as well. But should be clear that MUTCD, Legal Code of Virginia, this marking has no meaning. So that's why you don't see them often on VDOT facilities other than at, like I said, park and rides. Okay. New this year, or new to the standards, I should say, are the inlaid markers, the PIMs, if you will, the plastic inlaid markers, and these are replacing our old snow plowable raised pavement markers, you know, the heavy, clunky things that get pulled up out of the road quite often. So these are shown to be, you know, equally durable, but or even more so, with a lot less potential for the problems that were associated with the old snow plowable raised pavement markings. But there are some changes to how they're applied, the dimensions for the grooves, etc. So,
Chris,
oh,
there you go.
you got one, that's right.
Got a little show and tell.
Yes, so you can see, all right, so this is what they look like, and we'll pass it around so that you can each see them, but nothing like the old snow plowable raised pavement markers, right, that I have on a paperweight. You know, I have to pick it up with two hands, how heavy they are. So note that you know, VDOT has full confidence in this product, good track records in, maybe not, we have a story? Well, they have been demonstrated to be highly effective in Maryland and Kentucky and West Virginia and many other states. So we feel like this is a good addition to our standards. So we're not going to get into all the details of why we changed, but be aware that these are now in there. We'll talk a little bit about them. But it's important to reiterate our decision-making process for when and where to place these. The old snow plowable raised pavement markers were quite often put in excess. They were doubled up on occasion along double yellow lines, for example. The spacing, they were put in at half the spacing. And so we just want to be clear that that is not necessary, that the single line of delineators is sufficient and the 80-foot spacing is sufficient. So again, saving on those life cycle costs, we want to apply these devices accordingly. 2020, TED may consider revising and simplifying the language in the Virginia supplement to address these items. It's important, again, the spacing, I can't emphasize that enough, is that actually there's been a proven crash disbenefit, so negative CMF, right? If you over-apply the snow-plowable raised pavement markers, the old markings, and which would be applicable to the new PIMs as well. So we don't want to over-apply it thinking, well, if I just throw a whole bunch of them out there, it's got to be a safer roadway, right? Actually, no, there's statistics that show that it's the opposite. It's having an increased crash effect. So question to you guys, what are your thoughts on the markers? I heard some chuckles.
Same markers could be used for temporary condition during MOT when shift of.
So
Can they be used in a temporary condition, Harry?
I would only go to that expense if you're trying to have them survive the snowplow.
Well, we have no options when certain conditions require to use markers. When it's shift and it's.
You would use depending on the situation, you would use the raised plastic marker that's used in all the southern states for a shift. So that's a standard would remain. These are all permanent installation, not temporary.
And if I can add to that, in the work area protection manual, they refer to the temporary raised plowable markers. That's what you would normally use for any short-term or long-term lane shift. Yeah.
So again, we're not going to get into all the details of how these are installed, but it is important to note that these require a much longer groove. So longitudinally, the groove that these are placed in are much longer. They're 84 inches, which is a lot longer than the old SRPMs. They can be reduced to as short as 54-inch grooves, though. That's usually has to do with whether if you're on a tight curve, for example, and it has more to do with the contractor and whether or not they can get those 84-inch long grooves. Question here?
Is there any concern with rainwater get stuck in the, the pothole in there?
That's a good question. The question, Mark and Harry, was whether or not there's concern with water getting.
So what happens is that when it's poured down rain, obviously it's going to fill up to the extent of the depth of that groove, which is relatively shallow. But as soon as traffic moves, it blows out. So in the limited review that our materials division has done on the test site, the water is blown out, and it's been a non-issue. In driving Interstate 95, they have a groove with the RPM in the groove that's not being maintained, but the water just blows out. So I guess if you were the only car on the road approaching and it poured down rain, yes, you would. What would happen is you'd have limited visibility. You wouldn't see the RPM until you're almost right on it. That's kind of the issue you have.
So how do we clean those out after we do snow removal and sand gets in them, fills the gap?
So what's going to happen is if the snow gets in there and freezes, obviously, the plow wouldn't necessarily catch it.
You know, I'm talking about like like in spring after we've already sanded and salted all the roads and now we have that debris still on the road.
To the extent that the traffic will blow it out, it will blow out. But as you're approaching a marker that's gotten partially covered, the groove is filled, it's got, you'll see it when you get up on it, is what happens. So your purview distance is reduced by the action of that salting and sanding.
If I can add to that, so we're not just relying on our gut instinct on this. There is some research out there, principally from University of Kentucky, that has specifically looked at how much of the time are these grooves occluded by whether it's water or sand or snow. And basically their studies to date have been a lot of just repeated drive-bys of roads. And there's a lot of these in Kentucky, and as well as in Maryland, but Kentucky has been the one that researched this more. And what they found is it's a relatively low percentage. It does seem like what Harry's saying, that whether you're talking about water or sand, yes, sometimes they do get occluded, but it seems to dissipate fairly quickly. So are these as perfect as the snow plowable, cast iron snow plowable markers when it comes to visibility during rain? Probably not, but they're pretty good. And, you know, as you can see from the ones passing around, they're a whole lot less weight than the cast iron markers. But we are gonna, be working with the Virginia Research Council to do additional research into this subject in 2020. That's a commitment that, VDOT has made.
How about the cost compared to the old one?
Should be similar in cost, ultimately. And we're basing that on the bid tabs again from Maryland and Kentucky. So a snow plowable marker, I think the statewide average is $30, maybe $35 a piece. And when you do the way that Virginia is proposing to do it, where it's just a single marker and a 7-foot groove, should be pretty comparable in price. Like Kentucky actually is seeing comparable prices, and they do 2 markers and a 9-foot groove, so they're doing a little bit differently than us. That being said, costs may be higher for 2020 because there is some one-time costs to the contractors out there that they have to change out their equipment. And allegedly, there's only one manufacturer of cutting equipment that's very specialized cutting equipment out there, and they've got a long backlog of orders. So we do have a bit of a concern that there may be higher prices for 2020, but we'll see. I think the first of the schedules, bid opening was this week, and so the bid tabs should be available in a few weeks for the first of those.
What is the lifespan of these versus our old ones?
Should be about the same. The lens itself needs to be replaced every 3 years. That won't change, just like it is now. And that is something that we're working internally to try and make sure that our districts have the budgets that they need so that they can do the cyclical lens replacement. But as far as the marker, assuming you install it correctly and the epoxy is mixed correctly and all that, it should last the life of the pavement, same as what you have now with the cast iron markers. And similarly with the groove, Harry alluded to earlier, we've still got some old locations with recessed grooves and bridge decks, and other states will do recessed markers, and it doesn't seem like there's any issue with it causing larger pavement damage issues. That groove that edge stays pretty sharp.
One more question. I would assume before mill and overlay, we have to remove these first. Is that the case?
Yeah, so, you're talking about in future years when you start to do mill and overlay.
Right.
Yeah, that's a bit of an open question. I mean, with cast iron markers, you've always had to remove them. Obviously a milling machine can't mill through cast iron. With this, I've heard mixed messages. Some people say that, the milling machine could just cut right through this because it's plastic. Other people say that no, it would, just like we were talking about earlier with B6 tape, that you would still have to remove them. There's also concerns about, since some of our districts like to do like a latex modified types of surface treatment on the roads, what are we going to do with these? So I don't think that's an issue that's necessarily solved today, but it is an issue that needs to be addressed. As the markers that are installed in 2020, they're all on brand new roads, but at some point those roads obviously do need to be resurfaced.
What happens to the breakaway tabs when the snow plow will do the snow plow?
They break away. It won't even have, within weeks. The ones that were installed on 295, all those tabs are already broken away well before the first snowplow ever came through there.
So is there any environmental issues with that? Plastic on the road?
No,
It's
short answer is no.
Yeah, so it is not the type of biodegradable plastic that's in your water bottle that is alleged to be an environmental issue because it's ended up in the fish stomach. This tab is not going to degrade. It's one of the things about this is very durable. So basically, it's no different than having a piece of metal plug, if you will, on the side of the road. So it's not like it's going to pollute the water system or anything, or fish could, be willing to swallow a black tab, if you will, the way they're absorbing the microparticles from a plastic bottle. So it's not believed to be any kind of an environmental issue.
If I can add to that also, so we did kick around the idea of, is there a way to get the contractors to proactively break off the tabs? It just didn't seem like that was feasible because you can't just do it the second you install it. You have to wait for the epoxy to harden, and no other state is doing it. I'd also point out this is not the only time where VDOT litters, for lack of a better word. I mean, if you think of those temporary plowable markers that we're using on work zones and other states are using on a routine basis, those things do, pop away from the road surface eventually. So that's just the way it is.
And what is the purpose of these breakaway tiles?
It's just for installation, so for ease of the contractor. So as he sets it down, the tabs kind of rest on the surface on the side of the grooves there.
Okay, so just really one thing to note is that now, because of a result of these new pins and the width that they are, our standards for the double yellow lines has increased from 6 inches to 7 inches so that we can fit those between the markings. And just to reiterate what I said before, there's never any reason in new pavement to ever have the 2 lines, columns of markers. The only time you would ever do that, perhaps, is if you were retrofitting the PIMs into an existing roadway. Okay, just a few more slides. So the next few sheets in your books include a table that shows the requirements for specific surface types. So just try to go through these pretty quickly. In asphalt, you can use the same asphalt emulsion material that's used for rumble strips. So if you're applying both the rumble strips and PIMs, it's the same emulsion. In concrete, you would use a clear sealant, similar to the stuff that you would use for waterproofing your bridge decks. So when we're talking about the thin mix asphalt, concrete overlay, there's some concern that the final lift.
I'm sorry, I'm going to need to interrupt the tobacco thing. This slide is old news. As of about a week ago, we are installing plastic inlaid markers on tobacco surface. So saith the chief engineer. So
We will get, we'll make sure everybody, we got everybody's email address. We'll make sure everybody gets an update on this one.
yes.
Okay.
Things are fluid sometimes in this world, so FYI.
So for bridge decks, it's important that we understand the functional classification of the roadways because the Structure and Bridge specifies stainless steel rebar for certain functional classification and just rebar on others. So if we're grooving into the material, we want to be aware of the potential for corrosion. So know what type of functional classification so we know what's under those surfaces on our bridge decks. The latex modified is, it's kind of like a slurry seal and other such surface treatments, but it's meant for higher volume roads. It has about 3/8 inch thickness. Up until now, VDOT standard practice for the latex modified was to protect the snowplowable raised pavement markings. So they weren't removed, they were protected while the goo was placed, but then the problem was that instead of just having your little hole for your snow plowable race, it became bigger, more cavernous. So not everybody was necessarily verifying that the SRPMs, they were secure when they were coming back through and applying the latex modified, so that was a problem. It was also, like I said, it was hard to protect the marker and not have that hole become larger. So VDOT's new policy is that all of the existing SRPMs shall be removed in conjunction with all latex modified surfaces, starting with the 2020 paving schedule. All right. Traffic pattern changes. Cast iron RPMs represent very low risk if they are secure in the pavement. Proactive removal is not desirable, so it's not requiring go out and remove them all, given that the important safety benefit that they still do provide in the retroreflectivity that they provide, especially wet night retroreflectivity. But if the reflectors have been removed, you just have the cast iron left with no reflectors, because of traffic shift, then the SRPM represents a safety risk because they still can come up out of the pavement. That's why they are a safety risk. They're no longer providing the safety benefit. Moreover, in a situation like the photo you see here, which was taken when there was a permanent change in a lane configuration, we want to make sure that we do extract those SRPMs, when there's either a permanent lane shift or even a long-term temporary, because we don't want our wheel paths going over those SRPMs. So those must be removed. Okay. Finally, the designer's responsibility, the pavement marking manager's responsibility for resurfacing contracts. Pavement marking manager has the ultimate responsibility to ensure that the PM standards are followed. The PM series standards are most often applied during resurfacing projects as part of larger resurfacing contracts. When you're working on these resurfacing contracts, it is critical that the pavement marking manager refer to these PM series sheets. Recognize that many times what is out there in the field today, it does not reflect these PM markers, so it is the pavement marking manager's responsibility to make sure that what is being placed does adhere to those standards. We can no longer just replace in kind. Okay, we have to make sure that we are adhering to these. Recognizing that there could be an increase in cost and life cycle costs in doing so, but we do need to make sure that we're bringing all of our roadways up to standard. There's a cost associated with proper eradication of unnecessary markings. That's why it's important that we put them out correctly when we're resurfacing. We don't want to have to come back after the fact, realize that it's incorrect, eradicate. Eradication is expensive. Improper eradication or maintenance can lead to the material failing. So it is the responsibility to get the markings in there correctly the first time. PM series standards take precedence over the Virginia supplement. So if you do see a discrepancy between the Virginia supplement and the PM standards do overrule the supplement. Pavement marking managers have some room for flexibility, as we discussed throughout this module, if there's sufficient justification using engineering judgment. And then finally, that any of those deviations, though, should be documented when you are deviating from the PM standards. All right, and finally, here's just an example of some pavement marking sketch examples. The type that you might see, not in a design project, but in a resurfacing project. This is an example from Nova. Jessica might recognize this one. Second one on the right is from Richmond. So just want to give you a couple of examples of how we can take care of very complex situations, like you see this one, with a no plan type of a document here. All right.
So, can I insert a quick comment, though? So one of the important things when anyone is helping to build the quantities for a paving schedule is when you have something that is additional or something perhaps somewhat unique, is to be sure it's listed in the what's called the schedule of routes. That's where the guy who's the paving contractor, and if the subcontractor are working for him sharp, that's where they're looking first. The sketches are obviously critical. Even, you know, a marked up Google image with corrections, because the Google image is going to be out of date, is important. So in addition to doing that, it's also kind of critical to show up at pre-construction and make sure they're aware of the fact that you're changing the no passing zone, or you're adding bike lanes at the last minute, so you need a change order. All those things are all critical to make sure it all comes together. I have to sit in meetings and listen to the industry fuss because they don't have the information that they need to do it, or they've got some excuse as to why they didn't follow what was in there. So it's just the more you can do up front, the less problems are later and the less need for eradication.